Welcome to the Hampton History Museum. Today we're going to talk about this installation, which does not contain a real skeleton. This is a reproduction of a skeleton, but it is exactly accurate as to how this skeleton was found, not too far from the museum, on the grounds where the Crowne Plaza Hotel is being built. One of the things about archaeology and history is when you find some sort of an artifact, it doesn't come with a book or instructions. So you have to use your intelligence and your prior knowledge to try to figure out the clues as to what the artifact is. So I'm going to lead you through some of the clues that we have about this particular artifact. For one thing, this skeleton was located in non-consecrated ground. It was not buried, for example, in the graveyard at St. John's Church. This skeleton was buried in the tidal area where water would wash over the sand. So it was not buried with a lot of respect and ceremony. The second clue is that it was not buried in a coffin, as it would have been if it had had a funeral in a religious ceremony. The third clue is that this skeleton was buried face down. If you look at the bones, this is the right arm bone. These are the left arm bones, the skeleton, the ribs, the hips, and the legs. Unfortunately, when this skeleton was located, the head had been crushed, or the skull, I should say, had been crushed by construction equipment. The only people who were buried face down were people who were criminals or people with disreputable reputation. So that's one of our first clues as to who this skeleton belonged to. He was buried face down, facing the hell that he was going to, as opposed to a Christian burial, where he would have been buried on his back with his arms crossed over his chest so that he could look at the heaven where his soul was going. Another clue we have as to the identity of this skeleton is the fact that it is male, and we know that because of the distance between the pelvic bones. Generally speaking, men's pelvises are more narrow than women's because they don't have to give birth. If we look down here, we see that the leg bones of the calves have been broken. This was done prior to this person's death. And it was common in those days for criminals to have their legs broken to convince them that it wasn't a very good idea to continue to do their crimes. The feet are also missing, but we think the feet were scavenged after the skeleton was buried, after the body was buried, rather, by animals. Remember, this skeleton was not buried in a coffin, and it was not buried in firm soil. It was buried in sandy soil. So we put all those things together with what we know about Hampton history. We have documented records that say 2 sailors were captured and accused and convicted of piracy in 1719 and were executed here in Hampton. Their names were not recorded, and what became of their bodies was not recorded, but we have pretty strong evidence that suggests that this might have been one of the 2 pirates who was buried unceremoniously and without any respect, frankly, here in Hampton. Someday we may discover the name of this particular person, and it's likely that we'll discover the name in something like this fashion. Somebody in England will be looking in their family's attic, and they will discover a very old 1700s diary. And in that diary, some young woman may lament that great uncle Sylvester was tried and executed as a pirate in the far-off colony of Virginia in a little town called Hampton. And that's sometimes what we have to do to put 2 and 2 together to come up with 4 with regard to artifacts. Museums get their displays and their artifacts in 3 basic ways. The first way is if people donate items to the museum either during their lifetime or in their wills after their death. Another auctions and purchasing them, or purchasing items from private collectors. And the third way museums get items is by going out and digging them up, by using archaeological techniques and tools. But just like the skeleton, if you dig up your archaeology, you have to use your intelligence and your prior knowledge to try to figure out just exactly what it is that you have found. It may interest you to know that the real skeleton that this display represents was reburied with Franklin Moore ceremony than he was buried the first time in an unmarked location here in Hampton. And the city fathers and the historians here at the museum know where that location is, but it's an unmarked location. And hopefully his bones will rest more comfortably than they did the first time.